We're not a museum. You want handouts? Try the soup kitchen." The words slammed into the room like a hammer, sharp, public, final. Before anyone could speak, the store owner's hand tore straight through the old photograph, the sound of the rip cruel in the silence. It echoed off pegboards and metal racks, louder than it should have been, louder than Gary Wallace had expected. The photo's two halves fluttered like leaves caught in a crosswind before he dropped them carelessly into the open trash bin beside the counter. Gary didn't move. He stood there, still holding his cap respectfully in one hand, the other hand now empty, slightly curled where the picture used to rest. His coat was buttoned to the collar despite the heat in the store. His shoes were polished. His spine, even at 82, was mostly straight. Only his eyes gave him away, the way they blinked slower now, as if absorbing something far heavier than the moment itself. The store fell utterly silent. A hammer clinked against its hook somewhere in the back, the only sound to dare follow the insult. Maria, the woman at the register, had stopped ringing up a pair of batteries. Her eyes had shifted from Gary to the photo in the trash, then back again. Her lips were parted, but no words came. Just breath. Just disbelief. Gary reached slowly into his coat pocket, pulled out the envelope the photo had been kept in, and tucked it quietly away again. Now empty. He hadn't spoken yet. He didn't seem angry, but something about the stillness of him made the air feel tighter, heavier. Kyle Welders, the store owner, turned back to his till and muttered, not quietly, "Tired of these old guys acting like we owe 'em something." Gary lowered his cap to his side. A simple, small movement, not dramatic. But the way he held it, fingers tight at the rim, arm trembling just slightly, told more than words ever could. Through the wide front windows, the street shimmered in the afternoon heat. Two men were standing on the sidewalk now. Veterans, their dress jackets sharp, each with a small patch near the heart. They had just exited a community luncheon nearby. One of them was mid-step when he froze. The other narrowed his eyes, staring directly at the man inside the store who had just ripped the photograph in half. Inside, Maria finally moved, just a step, a small one, toward Gary. But Kyle's voice came again. "Don't even start, Maria. He's not buying anything." Gary glanced at her, met her eyes with a calm that carried decades. Then he turned. No words, just the soft scuff of his shoes as he made his way to the door. The bell above it hadn't finished ringing before the first pair of boots crossed the store's threshold behind him, but someone had been watching through the glass. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. The door closed behind him with the tired jingle of a bell that had rung for thousands of other customers, but somehow never sounded quite like this before. Gary Wallace stepped out into the golden haze of early afternoon, the sun casting long, angled shadows from the front awning of the store onto the hot pavement. His hand, still holding his cap, hung at his side, loose now, no longer clenched. The other hand pressed gently against his coat pocket, where the now empty envelope rested, its flap curled slightly, as if confused by the absence of the thing it had protected for decades. The heat wrapped around him slowly, not oppressive, but heavy in a different way. It settled into his shoulders as he turned right, walking with deliberate steps down the sidewalk that ran alongside the row of small businesses that had stood since before some of the younger shop owners were born. He didn't walk fast. His limp was subtle, but visible, like the ghost of an old injury too long ignored to demand sympathy anymore. His shoes, black and polished, tapped against the concrete in a steady rhythm. Tap, pause, tap, pause. Not the limp of weakness, but of memory, each step holding something that used to move differently. Back inside, Maria still stood behind the register, her fingertips resting on the edge of the counter. She hadn't moved since the moment Gary left. Her eyes followed the slow sway of the door as it closed completely. The silence hadn't left the room. It only deepened, as though even the tools on the wall knew something sacred had just been broken. Gary had been coming in every Wednesday for as long as she could remember. Always the same time. Always alone. He didn't talk much, never lingered, and never asked for help. But there was a ritual to his presence, like the way he removed his cap upon entry, and how he greeted her with a small nod that said, "I see you, and I appreciate you," without needing a single word. She remembered once, months ago, when she struggled to lift a box of wire reels. He had stepped in, no hesitation, no bravado, and lifted one with surprising steadiness. "You're young, but I've got a better grip," he'd said with a gentle chuckle, placing the box where it needed to go and patting the cardboard as if sealing an old memory. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but today, it returned with an ache. The sound of the paper tearing was still ringing in her ears. Gary's image, standing there, not even angry, just still, had etched itself into her memory. His posture wasn't slouched, wasn't weak. It was steady, grounded, and it made what Kyle had done feel all the more jarring. Ripping that photo hadn't made Gary look smaller. It had made everything else in the room look cheap. Outside, Gary reached the edge of the sidewalk where the curb sloped down. The light wind tugged at his coat slightly, just enough to lift one corner. He paused, squinting at the sky for a moment, as if checking the hour not by watch but by instinct. Then, from his coat pocket, the edge of something white fluttered loose, a jagged piece of the photograph. He noticed it, bent slowly. His hand, weathered and dark-spotted from age and sun, reached for the piece with a care that betrayed its fragility. As he knelt, one knee cracking audibly, he winced just slightly, but said nothing. He gathered the piece as if it was something alive, something that had trusted him once. Across the street, two men had stopped walking. They stood shoulder to shoulder in dark jackets, with military insignia stitched into the sleeves. One wore a cap from the United States Navy. The other, a dress coat from the United States Army with clean creases and medals pinned above the heart. They had just come from a luncheon down the street, something low-key, meant for city veterans to reconnect once a month. They had seen the moment through the glass, the gesture, the rip, and now they saw Gary gathering the piece of the photo from the pavement, dusting it gently against the front of his coat, then standing with deliberate effort, almost in slow motion. Neither veteran spoke. One nodded once to the other, as if to say, "I saw it too." Back inside the store, Kyle Welders shuffled behind the counter, stacking receipts and grumbling to himself. The flag patch on his vest, a stitched-on gesture of patriotism that had long faded from true meaning, caught the light from the window and flickered slightly. He hadn't noticed the silence, or perhaps he had, but preferred to ignore it. Maria's hands had dropped now. She stepped out from behind the counter and slowly approached the trash bin. The photo lay there, torn into two jagged halves. One side bore the young face of a soldier, square jaw, calm eyes, and just the faintest shadow of a smile. The other piece showed a polished boot, part of a uniform, and what looked like the corner of a medal. She didn't touch them, she simply looked. And then, quietly, she whispered beneath her breath, "He deserved better." The words weren't meant for Kyle. They weren't even meant to be heard, but they landed like a whisper that shook the walls. Gary kept walking, no faster, no slower. He tucked the torn photo back into the envelope, then slid it gently into the inner pocket of his coat, the same pocket where he used to keep letters from his unit, letters he never threw away. He turned the corner at the end of the block and disappeared into the gold-drenched light. And in the stillness he left behind, the store held its breath. Gary wouldn't ask for help, but help had already seen enough. The sidewalk shimmered under the weight of the late afternoon sun, baking the cracks until the air itself seemed to ripple. Gary's footsteps moved across that soft heat like time passing, not slow, not fast, but steady, like the way he might have marched once. His cane tapped lightly beside each step, the tip clicking against uneven concrete, occasionally catching in the spaces between old paving slabs. He never cursed it, never showed frustration, only adjusted and kept walking. The envelope in his coat pressed lightly against his chest, as if reminding him with every motion what now lay inside. A photo no longer whole, no longer honored. The corner of the torn paper scratched against the inside lining of his coat, but he made no move to fix it. Some things he knew were meant to be carried the hard way. The old man passed a cafe with shaded outdoor seating, the kind of place with rusted umbrella stands and wire chairs that groaned when you sat down. The breeze picked up just enough to stir one of the photo fragments loose, slipping it upward through the open gap in his coat. It caught on the air like a leaf, and for a moment, it almost danced. Gary turned instinctively, his eyes catching it mid-flight. His shoulders tensed as he reached out with one hand, but the wind pushed it just a few feet farther, sending it drifting toward the street like a memory trying to escape. The moment was not dramatic. No chase. Just an old man stepping forward, slow and stiff, towards something the world had decided didn't matter anymore. He crouched with effort, his knees protesting with a familiar ache. A passing teenager glanced his way and kept walking. A car idled at the red light, its radio muffled behind glass. Nobody noticed. Nobody offered help, not because they were cruel, but because they had grown used to this kind of sight. An old man moving like the world didn't owe him anything. And maybe, they believed, it didn't. Gary picked up the fragment with the same care he once used for folding letters from a buddy named Curtis, who hadn't made it home. The piece showed the corner of his uniform, the lower edge of a metal ribbon, and just the curve of his younger self's hand at his side. It was barely a sliver, but it still carried a shape he remembered. He stood, slowly, brushing grit from the edge with his thumb. His breath came a little shorter now, like a stair had been climbed where none existed. He turned and resumed his path, placing the piece back into the envelope without looking again. Across the street, one of the veterans who had seen the incident was still watching. He had paused outside a tailor's shop, pretending to look at the window display. But his reflection watched Gary. He didn't move. Not yet. Inside the hardware store, Maria hadn't returned to the counter. She stood in the shadowed back corner, gripping the edge of a shelf, her thumb pressed hard against the rounded head of a bolt. Her eyes stung in that strange way that wasn't quite crying, just full. Her body was still, but her thoughts roared. The image of the photograph in the trash, Gary's calm, and the snap of Kyle's voice played again and again. She knew what it was like to watch something you respected be dismissed. Her uncle, Carlos, had served in the Vietnam War, came home quiet, spent most of his life trying not to talk about it. But when he did, it was with eyes that had seen too much. The same eyes Gary had. When she was younger, Carlos used to tell her that soldiers weren't just shaped by war. They were reshaped by the silence that followed it. That silence lived in Gary, in the way he moved, in the way he never demanded anything. A door creaked at the front. Kyle leaned into the counter with a grunt, muttering under his breath as he looked over inventory sheets. He hadn't noticed she hadn't come back. Or maybe he didn't care. The scent of old sawdust and metal filings drifted from the storage area, thick and metallic. Maria inhaled slowly, then walked back to the front, her footsteps quiet, eyes not on Kyle, but the front window. Gary was gone. Only the shimmer of heat and the stretch of the sidewalk remained. One man sitting outside on the bench took a sip from his drink and leaned toward the stranger beside him. "Some people live too long to stay useful," he said casually, as if discussing a flat tire or the weather. The stranger chuckled once, nodding. The comment floated across the sidewalk like a discarded napkin, dirty and careless. Maria heard it. Her jaw stiffened. Her fingers curled slightly into her palms, but she said nothing. Not yet. She watched the breeze toss a crumpled receipt across the lot and thought about how some things, and some people, were thrown away before they ever had a chance to speak. Inside Kyle's store, the air felt heavier than it should have. The overhead fan spun in lazy circles, doing nothing to stir the tension that had sunk into the floorboards. Maria looked down at the register, still logged in under her name, still tracking sales as if nothing had happened, as if Gary's torn photo wasn't resting at the bottom of the trash just 2 feet away. And in the distance, beyond the edge of Main Street, Gary Wallace turned onto a smaller road shaded by tall oaks and lined with homes, built back when towns were built around train whistles and handshake deals. His steps were slower now, not from pain, but from weight, the kind that settles into your bones when the world mistakes silence for weakness. He passed a window where an American flag hung, faded and still. He nodded to it, a small gesture unnoticed by anyone, but not forgotten by him. Not everything worth saluting flew high, and not everyone who saw what happened was ready to forget it. The sound of laughter came too quickly after Gary had gone. Not the laughter of joy, but the sharp, hollow kind, meant to fill silence with something louder than conscience. Kyle leaned against the counter, arms crossed over his stained apron, watching the parking lot through the window as if the scene had left no trace. His smirk hadn't fully faded. It hung there, twisted into the corner of his mouth like the last breath of a bad joke. Across from him, a man in a ball cap and denim jacket chuckled under his breath. "These guys think wearing a badge from the 50s earns them a trophy," Kyle said, waving a hand toward the empty sidewalk. The other man nodded. "Back in my day, we didn't ask for parades every time we paid a bill. It was meant to be a joke." But Maria, still near the register, didn't laugh. She didn't even look up. Her hands busied themselves with the receipt roll, fingers moving automatically, the tape spinning without meaning. The torn halves of the photograph still sat in the trash behind her, face up. One half had shifted, exposing Gary's shoulder and part of a metal bar, the ribbon edges still proud even in pieces. The other half had turned slightly, revealing just his eyes, focused, young, unwavering. Outside, the heat seemed to press down heavier. Across the street, 4 veterans were now gathered just outside the small cafe, all dressed in neat, modest attire, not flashy, not ceremonial, just men who had once served and carried it quietly. Their voices were low, their posture alert. 2 of them had already seen what happened. The other 2 listened intently, eyes narrowing in turns. One of them adjusted a folded flag case beneath his arm, not to display it, but to keep it from slipping. The group crossed the street slowly. They didn't march. They didn't confront. They simply walked, like any men with a purpose that didn't need permission. Maria saw them through the window. There was something about the way they moved. No panic, no rush, but absolute clarity in every step. It reminded her of a moment from years before, at her uncle's memorial, the way the honor guard approached the casket. No words, no wasted movement, just a presence that filled the space with weight. She turned back toward the counter. Kyle had returned to inventory sheets, red pen in hand, head down, chewing the end of a pencil. He didn't notice the shift, or if he did, he refused to acknowledge it. The front door opened. The bell jingled like always, cheerful, oblivious, and then fell silent. 6 boots crossed the threshold, not loud, not aggressive, just firm. Kyle looked up. The first man removed his cap, revealing a shaved head and a long scar that ran behind his left ear. His voice was low and calm. "We heard something happened here." Kyle blinked. "What's that got to do with you?" The man nodded toward the trash bin. "Everything," Kyle scoffed. "If this is about that photo, save it. He's a customer, not royalty. I don't hang pictures for anyone else." Another veteran stepped forward, younger, leaner, a patch on his jacket showing the emblem of the United States Marine Corps. "No one's asking for decoration, just a little respect." He set something on the counter, a small item wrapped in cloth. When the fabric fell away, it revealed a worn nameplate, brass, tarnished at the edges, engraved with G. Wallace, United States Army. The store grew quiet again. One by one, the other veterans placed small tokens beside it. A folded ribbon, a patch from a unit long retired, a faded photo of a barracks from 1962. Not trash, not threats, just memories that deserved space. Kyle stared at the items, then at the men. His mouth opened, ready with another line, another defense, but nothing came out. Maria watched it all from behind the register, and something in her chest shifted. There was no speech, no confrontation. The veterans turned, adjusted their jackets, and left the way they came. Boots scuffing lightly against the tile floor, the bell above the door chiming once more as it closed behind them. The counter remained full, not with products, but with a quiet reckoning. Kyle stepped back, as if the items took up more space than they physically could. His fingers curled into his apron, knuckles white. Maria moved from behind the counter and gently placed the receipt roll to the side. Then she walked to the trash bin. She looked down at the torn photo, still whole in its message, even if broken in form. She didn't pick it up. She didn't speak, but her presence beside it made the silence louder. Kyle shifted uncomfortably. Outside, the veterans crossed the street again, disappearing into the growing shade of late afternoon, their work done, not in noise, but in presence. Back at the register, the air was still. Even the ceiling fan above had slowed its spin, the chain rattling softly in the silence. Something broke that day, but not just the photograph. It was the invisible thing, the thread that connects people when respect is intact. The thing you don't notice until it's gone. And for the first time since Gary had left, Maria realized just how quiet the store had become. Gary's house sat 2 blocks off Main Street, a modest single-story home with chipped white paint and a crooked mailbox that still bore his last name in faded black letters. Wallace. The yard was tidy, though not manicured. The grass, recently trimmed, carried a faint golden sheen beneath the late-day sun. 2 wind chimes hung from the eaves above the porch, their aluminum tubes swaying gently in the breeze but offering no sound, as if sensing the silence inside. He stepped onto the porch with the same patience he showed the world. He didn't fumble for his keys. He took them from his pocket with quiet precision and slid the right one into the lock on the first try. The door creaked open, not because it was old, but because he let it. The interior of the house was cool and dim. The light filtering through gauzy curtains turned the room a soft amber, like the warmth inside a sepia photograph. It was clean, orderly, a space built on habit. The scent of cedar and faint pipe tobacco lingered in the air, woven into the very wood of the place. Not smoke, but memory. Gary hung his coat on a simple wooden peg beside the door. From his chest pocket he drew the envelope with both hands, gently, reverently, and brought it to the small kitchen table that faced the window. That table was his chapel. It was here he wrote letters no one received anymore. It was here he sorted bolts and oiled tools he barely used. And it was here that he sat, just now, and unfolded the 2 torn halves of a life once whole. He didn't look at them right away. First, he unfolded a soft cloth, faded blue, and laid it flat across the table. He pressed out the creases with both palms, smoothed it into place. Then he lifted the photo fragments and set them atop the cloth, aligning them carefully, like matching the edges of a wound too fresh to tape. The image was damaged, yes, but what remained was unmistakable. The young man in uniform, standing proud in front of a tank, his jaw square, hair trimmed short, the light in his eyes distant, but not gone. His left hand rested on the barrel of the tank, his right clenched lightly at his side. The edge of a bronze star ribbon still hung at his chest, severed by the tear but present. Gary stared for a long moment, then reached for the small, neatly labeled drawer beneath the table. From it, he took a roll of clear tape. He held it in his hand, its plastic spool creaking faintly, but he didn't peel it. He set it back down. He had tape, but not everything needed fixing. Instead, he leaned forward and took a small cloth from his pocket, the kind once used to wipe rifle scopes, now worn thin, and brushed each photo fragment softly, one after the other. Dust lifted. A fine layer of grit, invisible to the eye, cleared from decades-old paper. He treated the photo like it was still alive. A light breeze passed through the open window, shifting the edge of the curtain. It danced across the tabletop, just enough to lift the corner of one photo half, and Gary placed his hand down, flat and firm, to hold it. He didn't move it. He just left his palm there, covering the image of the young man he once was. His thumb traced the edge of the uniform beneath the paper, a slow, absent motion. Above the table, a shelf lined the wall. It held 5 items: a folded flag in a glass case, a frame containing a military discharge document, yellowed but preserved, a row of ribbons beside an old field compass, and in the center, a letter. It was folded inside a plastic sleeve. The handwriting on the envelope was clean but fading. Curtis R. Landon, Forward Unit, 93, Quang Tri Province, 1967. Gary had read that letter more times than he could count. He never opened it anymore. He knew every line. Curtis had written it during a lull between patrols, describing the heat, the mosquitoes, the coffee that tasted like mud. But in the last lines, he wrote something Gary never forgot. If one of us doesn't make it home, the other one remembers. That's the rule. We carry the other's silence. Curtis hadn't made it home. Gary had carried that silence for over 5 decades. And today, he had tried, just once, to let that silence speak. Not for recognition, not for praise. Just to hang a photograph during Veterans Week. A quiet reminder that some things were worth remembering. He stared at the fragments of the photo, the ones Kyle Welders had torn, not by accident, not in anger, but in something worse: disregard. Outside, the street was quiet. Only the slow rustle of leaves shifting beneath the late-day wind. A single car passed, its tires hissing along the pavement. Gary exhaled, long, slow. Then he stood. He walked to the shelf and lifted the letter, not to open it, just to feel its weight again. When he returned to the table, he placed the letter beside the photo, then folded the cloth corners over both, like tucking something sacred into a safe place. He slid the cloth bundle into the envelope, then placed it back in the drawer. He didn't slam it, didn't sigh, just closed it gently, sealing memory back where it lived. His hand paused on the drawer handle for a moment, and then he whispered as if to no one, "It's all right, Curtis." I didn't forget. The sun had shifted just enough to cast the table in shadow, but the light still touched the edge of the shelf. It glinted off the frame's glass. The flag remained folded. The letter remained closed. The silence intact. But beyond the walls of that quiet house, beyond Gary's carefully maintained order, something had begun to stir, not in the form of noise or protest, but in the hearts of people who had seen something wrong and decided it wouldn't be forgotten. The store hadn't changed. The walls still held the same arrangement of socket wrenches and drill bits. The air still smelled faintly of rust and rubber, and the fading scent of yesterday's coffee filter. But something in the atmosphere had shifted. Not loud, not visible, but undeniable. Maria stood near the back of the store in the shadow of aisle 3, surrounded by extension cords and paint rollers. She had no reason to be there. No customer had called her over. No shelf needed restocking. She just stood with her hand on a box of galvanized nails, her thumb absently pressing into the cardboard corner as if searching for something to anchor herself to. The voices near the counter felt miles away, though she could still hear the scrape of Kyle's stool as he shifted his weight, and the soft murmur of paper as he flipped through receipts. He had gone quiet since the veterans left. Not apologetic, not reflective, just still. The kind of stillness that came not from humility, but from inconvenience. Maria closed her eyes for a moment. In her memory, she saw Gary again. Not as an old man, but as he had been months ago, standing beside her near the storage room when she dropped a box of concrete anchors. It had been heavy, and her shoulder was still sore from a recent sprain. He'd seen her struggle and moved without hesitation. "No shame in asking for help," he had said, lifting the box like it was full of feathers. "Even the strong get tired." He had smiled afterward, a quiet, worn smile, and then returned to browsing screws as if nothing had happened. Her Uncle Carlos had the same smile. He was a veteran too, Vietnam, came home to a country that hadn't quite known what to do with its soldiers. He used to sit on their porch with a folded cap in his lap, and a distant look in his eyes that she didn't understand as a child. but learned to respect as she grew. He never talked about what he saw, but he did tell her one thing before he passed. Watch how people treat the quiet ones. That'll tell you everything you need to know about their character. Her hand let go of the box. She turned and walked slowly toward the front, her sneakers soft against the tile floor. As she approached the counter, Kyle looked up from the receipt book with a neutral expression, like a man waiting for a complaint about pricing or stock. "You need something?" he asked, voice flat. Maria didn't answer immediately. She moved behind the counter, pulled open the drawer beside the register, and retrieved her name badge. The plastic was slightly scuffed from years of wear. Her name, Maria, still etched clean in white block letters. She stared at it for a moment, thumb brushing the edge. Then she unpinned it. Kyle raised an eyebrow. "What are you doing?" "I can't work here anymore," she said softly, placing the badge on the counter like a resignation letter written in silence. He leaned back, confused. "Because of some old photo?" She met his eyes. Not defiant, not dramatic, just steady. "No," she replied. "Because of someone you'll never be." Her words hung in the air like a held breath. Kyle opened his mouth as if to respond, but nothing came. He shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of the counter between them. Maria picked up her bag from the hook behind the register, slung it over her shoulder, and turned toward the door. She didn't look back. As she passed the trash bin near the register, her eyes flicked down one last time at the torn photograph inside. She said nothing, but something in her gaze changed. Not pity, not guilt, but decision. She pushed open the door. The bell above it chimed. The street beyond was warm, open, and waiting. She stepped into the sunlight, pulled the bag higher on her shoulder, and started walking. Not fast, not hesitant, just forward. She didn't know what came next, but she knew she wouldn't pretend silence was neutral anymore. Behind her, the bell above the door rang once more as it settled. The store returned to its stillness, but Maria didn't. She walked past the cafe where the veterans had sat earlier, past the old tailor's shop and the closed barber shop with the striped pole that hadn't spun in years. She didn't check her phone, didn't glance at her reflection in the windows. She was moving like a thread that had finally slipped free from the fabric that tried to hold it down. And somewhere down the street, in a small home, lit by the gold slant of late afternoon, an old man sat beside a folded photo and a letter written by a man who never came home. He didn't know it yet, but someone had just taken a step toward remembering him the right way. The heat outside had settled into stillness, that mid-afternoon hush where even the birds grew quiet. Across the street from Kyle's store, the light filtered through the high branches of elm trees, casting long, soft shadows onto the sidewalk like fingers reaching toward something unseen. Inside the store, the silence persisted, though Kyle didn't seem to notice. He shuffled through paperwork behind the counter with the kind of distracted agitation that fills the space after someone leaves you standing in the wake of your own choices. A pen tapped against the counter. His stool creaked under shifting weight, but nothing else moved. Then the door opened. It didn't slam. It didn't creak. It simply chimed, once cleanly, the soft ring of brass bells echoing through the narrow store. The veterans entered in a line, unhurried. No fanfare, no announcement. Just the quiet weight of presence. There were 6 of them, not in uniform, but wearing the kind of clothing that carried the past without having to announce it. Neatly pressed slacks, simple button-downs, a few jackets bearing patches or pins. Each man moved differently, one with a brace on his leg, another with a curved spine, another with shoulders that still squared every time he took a step. They were different in age, in body, in walk. But they shared something invisible and absolute. They had all once stood in the same kind of silence Gary had. One of them, a tall man with gray, close-cropped hair and deep-set eyes, paused just inside the door. He scanned the room slowly, then walked forward. The others followed. Kyle looked up, surprised, and instinctively stiffened. Something in the room shifted with them, the kind of shift that made even the dust in the air pause mid-fall. "Can I help you?" Kyle asked, his voice harder than it needed to be. The tall man stepped to the counter, pulled something from the inside of his jacket, and set it down carefully. It was a unit patch, faded olive green, its stitching worn but intact. Below the insignia, a small embroidered name in white thread. Wallace. The man looked Kyle in the eye. "Gary Wallace earned our respect. You lost it." Kyle blinked. He opened his mouth, but no words came. A second man approached, shorter, heavier, with hands that looked like they had bent metal and carried stretchers. He reached into his pocket and set down a folded ribbon. Nothing fancy, just a clean red, white, and blue bar once worn on a service coat. He didn't speak. A third man, eyes misted behind old glasses, placed a small black and white photo. It showed a group of soldiers in a muddy field, standing behind sandbags, the date scrawled in pen across the bottom corner. 1952. Gary was in it, fourth from the left. Young, grinning, helmet tilted back on his head. Each item made no sound when it touched the counter, and yet they rang louder than anything Kyle had said that day. He leaned back slowly in his stool, unsure what to do with his hands, with his face, with the cold weight beginning to settle behind his ribs. "I didn't know who he was," Kyle said, as if that explained anything. The tall man looked at him, not angry, not forgiving. That's the point. A fourth veteran, skin dark as mahogany and hands smooth with age, reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a worn playing card. The back had been scribbled on in pencil. Saigon, 1971, one more game, then home. He set it gently on the growing pile. The final man stepped forward. He carried nothing. Instead, he stood a pace back from the counter, placed his hand over his heart, and gave a short, silent nod toward the items left behind. The message was clear. They hadn't come to shout. They hadn't come to threaten. They had come to mark a line. Kyle stared at the counter. He couldn't look at the men. He couldn't look at what they'd brought. So he looked past them, toward the door, toward the street, toward the space where Gary had stood. But nothing there could save him from the mirror he'd just been handed. The bell above the door rang again. One by one, the veterans turned and walked out, their steps as even and unhurried as when they'd entered. Their shoulders remained squared. Their backs didn't bend. No one looked behind them. They didn't need to. The door clicked closed behind the last of them, and Kyle Welders was left alone behind the counter, the soft hum of fluorescent lights above him the only sound left in the world. The counter, usually cluttered with receipts and tape guns, now bore a sacred kind of weight, a battlefield of memory and meaning laid out in cloth, metal, paper, and silence. He reached toward the unit patch, his fingers stopping inches away. He didn't touch it. Behind him, the ceiling fan turned lazily, its pull chain swinging side to side, making no difference in the warmth that was now pressing against the back of his neck. He shifted his weight again, looked down at the name badge pinned to his apron. The letters spelled his name clearly, Kyle, but in that moment, it felt small. The clock on the wall ticked. Time moved forward. But something in the air, something sacred, unseen, had decided to stay behind. By the time the sun sank low enough to turn the window panes gold, the story had already begun to drift through town, carried not by shouting voices or viral headlines, but by quiet conversations whispered over fences, murmured in grocery store aisles, and passed between church pews like a secret too heavy to keep. It started with Maria. She sat at the corner of her dining table that evening, in a small apartment 2 blocks away from the store, the light from a nearby lamp washing her face in amber hues. Her phone lay face up beside a cooling cup of tea. The Open Notes app glowed with typed words, calm, measured, and clear. She didn't add hashtags. She didn't name the store. She didn't need to. All she wrote was the truth. A man named Gary Wallace, 82 years old, brought a photo of himself in uniform to the store today. He asked if it could be displayed for Veterans Week. The owner ripped it in front of him, said we're not a museum, said he should try a soup kitchen. She paused, then added, "Gary didn't say a word. He just picked up the pieces and left. I quit my job today because of it. I couldn't be part of a place that treats someone like that." Then she posted it. No fury, no theatrics. Just a quiet account of something that had happened, and something that shouldn't have. By midnight, it had been shared over 400 times, mostly by people in town, some from nearby counties, a few from veteran support pages, where quiet readers stopped scrolling and let the story settle into them like dust, settling in a room no one had entered for years. The next morning, Kyle noticed the silence first. The store opened at 9, same as always. He unlocked the door, flipped the sign, and turned on the lights with the habitual rhythm of a man who'd done this more times than he could count. But by 10:30, not a single person had walked through the door. At 11, he made himself coffee, bitter and burnt from a machine that needed cleaning. He sat behind the counter, idly scrolling his phone, his eyes catching on a name he hadn't expected to see. Gary Wallace. He clicked the post, read the words once, then again. The counter beneath him seemed to shift, as though the air itself had changed weight. At noon, 2 regulars walked past the store without entering. One of them glanced through the window, saw Kyle sitting behind the counter, and looked away. The other shook his head slightly. Their footsteps didn't slow. The parking lot, usually holding 3 or 4 trucks by midday, was empty. The shade beneath the oak tree across the street, where men often parked and chatted after grabbing screws or a roll of electrical tape, remained still. No engines idled. No doors opened. At 2 o'clock, Kyle opened the register just to feel like something was happening. He counted bills that hadn't moved since the day before, coins that clinked in lonely piles. The drawer slid shut with a hollow clack. He looked toward the counter. The items left by the veterans were still there. He hadn't touched them. The photo, the ribbon, the patch, they hadn't moved. And now, neither had business. Outside, a paper flyer fluttered against the lamppost. Someone had pinned a message to the community board just down the street. It was printed on plain paper, ink slightly smudged from humidity. It read, "We remember Gary Wallace, do you?" No threats, no calls for protest, just a question. Kyle rubbed his temple. The bell above the door hadn't rung all day. By 4 o'clock he stood near the window, arms crossed, watching the sidewalk as though customers might materialize from thin air. A child passed by with his father, a pair that had come in every week for wood glue and spare bolts. The boy glanced toward the door, then looked up at his dad. The man shook his head. They kept walking. The silence was no longer quiet. It was accusatory, the kind of silence that followed a funeral, when the eulogies are over and only the regrets remain. At 5, Kyle tried to busy himself with inventory in the back, but the air in the storeroom felt close, and the overhead lights buzzed just enough to scrape his nerves. He returned to the front and sat back down, staring at the counter. He looked at the items again. They hadn't changed, but he had. Not dramatically, not with an epiphany, but with a crack, a thin hairline fracture running through the surface of the man who had, until yesterday, believed himself in control of everything that passed through his door. His eyes drifted to the brass patch with Gary's name stitched across the top. He reached out and touched it, fingertips grazing the fabric, coarse and soft from age. For the first time, he noticed the wear along the corners, the threading that had come undone just enough to speak of long travel, long use. He set it back down. Outside, the light was shifting toward dusk. He turned off the overheads one by one, each click of the switch sounding louder than it should. And for the first time since Maria left her name badge on the counter, Kyle Welders sat alone in his store, not surrounded by tools but by reminders. He picked up the counter bell, the one customers used to tap for attention. Its edge had cracked years ago, chipped by someone impatient. He turned it in his hand now, inspecting the fracture. He reached for a roll of tape, pressed the torn edge together, tried to fix it, but the crack remained visible. No matter how tightly he wrapped it, no matter how carefully he aligned the edges, The damage was permanent. He set it down and stared out the window at a town that had not shouted, had not stormed his doors, but had simply stopped showing up. The most deafening sound in his life had become the absence of footsteps. 3 weeks passed like the slow swing of a grandfather clock, deliberate, weighted, and heard even when it wasn't looked at. The store on Main Street remained open, but the rhythm of the place had changed. The bell above the door rang less, and when it did, it rang with the uncertain sound of someone stepping into a silence they weren't sure they agreed with. Kyle kept the lights on, the shelves stocked and the receipts filed, but the truth was simple and inescapable. The community had shifted their eyes elsewhere. 2 blocks east, in a smaller brick building that once held a sewing supply shop, a new sign was lifted onto a modest wooden post. The lettering wasn't showy, not designed by professionals. It was hand-painted carefully, with steady strokes and dark navy paint. It read, "Wallace Hardware, for the builders who served." There was no grand opening, no balloons or banners. Only a group of neighbors who brought coffee and folding chairs and helped sweep the sidewalk clean. Maria arrived early that morning with a toolbox in one hand and a paper bag full of muffins in the other. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, but her eyes held that quiet steadiness, the kind that no longer asked permission to do what was right. The store was smaller than Kyle's had been, with fewer aisles and less inventory, but what it lacked in size, it carried in soul. The front window, trimmed with faded blue shutters, held a small hand-lettered sign, "Veterans always welcome." There were no flags hanging from every wall, no overdone displays of red, white, and blue, just the soft light of the interior, the warmth of wooden floors, and a kind of reverence woven into the arrangement of things, a reverence that couldn't be bought. Maria spent her first afternoon organizing nails by hand. She sorted them not by size alone, but by where they were going to be placed. Which jars would be easy to reach for older customers? Which ones would rest near the register for those who came in slowly, with time in their hands? She had learned, in her years behind the counter, that respect wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was found in shelving height, in the placement of chairs, in the pause between a question and an answer. The veterans who had stood in Kyle's store weeks earlier came by one at a time, never together, never loudly. They came with tool belts, with measuring tape, with open schedules. One repaired a creaking hinge, another rewired the back lighting. The man with the folded flag case mounted the new sign himself, driving in the bolts with careful turns, as if the wood might remember the day it became more than lumber. On the second morning, as sunlight broke across the window, Maria reached beneath the front counter and lifted a wooden frame wrapped in linen. She set it gently on the wall hook behind the register. It was the same photo Gary had brought to Kyle's store, now restored. Not perfectly. The tear was still faintly visible across the bottom corner, and the crease over his uniform was slightly crooked, but that was part of the honesty. It hadn't been reprinted or replaced. It had been repaired. In the photo, Gary stood tall in his early 20s, jaw set, the metal at his chest catching the light even now. Behind him, the shadow of a tank loomed, a reminder of what he once stood beside and what he once stood for. The frame was simple oak, no plaque, no gilding, just a small inscription etched into the wood beneath it, for those who built with more than hands. Maria stood back and looked at it for a long moment. Her eyes didn't mist. Her breath didn't catch. She simply stood there, in the quiet hum of a store that now held meaning. She remembered the day she left her badge on Kyle's counter. She hadn't known what would come after. She had only known that the line had been crossed, and silence could no longer carry her. Now that silence had become something else entirely. It had become space. Space for respect. Space for memory. Space for people who had carried entire wars in their hearts, only to come home and ask for nothing more than dignity. As customers began trickling in, a slow but steady line of familiar faces, they each stopped to look at the photo. Some said nothing, some nodded, A few placed their fingers lightly on the wooden frame before stepping away, but none turned their back to it, and none asked why it was there, because they already knew. The sky that morning was the kind that held no judgment, overcast, soft. The light diffused through a thin veil of grey that made everything seem closer. It was a Wednesday, which mattered more than most would ever guess. Because for Gary Wallace, Wednesdays meant something. They meant routine. They meant motion. They meant the ritual of walking into town, coat buttoned up to the collar, cap in hand, and stepping into a world that often forgot men like him still carried themselves like soldiers, even when no one was watching. He didn't know what waited for him that morning. He left his home just past 8, the small home that still smelled like cedar and pipe tobacco. He wore the same coat, pressed the night before, and walked with the same careful rhythm down the sidewalk. Tap, pause, tap, pause. His gait was measured, not cautious but deliberate, like someone who had marched long distances in boots that never quite softened. The envelope rested inside his coat pocket again, though this time it carried only a folded letter and a patch. The photograph remained in its drawer, resting beside Curtis's words, too fragile now to bring out again. Gary turned the corner near the old post office, passing the familiar stretch of shops and diners, many of which had once welcomed him with casual nods and shallow greetings. But something in the air felt different now, not louder, just heavier. The way people looked at him had changed. Some nodded with more gravity than before. One man tipped his cap. A woman across the street paused her conversation, her eyes lingering on him for a second longer than custom required. As he neared the new hardware store, the one he'd heard about only in passing, he slowed his steps. The sign came into view. Wallace Hardware, for the builders who served. He stopped, stared. The name felt foreign in that context. His own name. Not shouted, not sold, just placed, as if it belonged, as if someone had made a space for it. He stood there for a moment, unsure whether to go inside. That's when the door opened, and a voice called gently toward him. "Come by," the man said. "Got something you forgot." It was the tall veteran from the group that had entered Kyle's store weeks before. His stance was easy, but his gaze was focused, the kind that didn't offer requests without meaning. Gary hesitated only a breath, then nodded once and stepped forward. The bell above the door chimed. A clean sound, a new sound, not the one from the old store. This one was brighter, higher pitched maybe, or just different because it meant something. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of cut pine and old varnish. The wooden floors creaked under Gary's steps, but not in protest, more like acknowledgement. The kind of sound a place makes when it recognizes the weight of a person's presence. Maria stood behind the counter, her sleeves rolled just above her elbows, hands dusted faintly with sawdust from setting shelves. She looked up, and her face softened into something like gratitude, like pride wrapped in humility. "Morning, Mr. Wallace," she said. "You were expected." Gary didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, just gave a small nod, hand still on the edge of the door. Then he saw it. Behind the counter, mounted on the wall at perfect eye level, framed in simple oak, was his photograph, the one that had been torn, now whole again, not flawless, the tear still faintly visible like a healed scar, but present, intact, framed not as decoration, but as declaration. Beneath it, a small brass plate read, "In honor of Gary Wallace, United States Army for those who built with more than hands." Gary stepped closer, breath slow. He stared for a long time, eyes scanning every detail, the curve of his old smile, the line of the medal, the faint crease across the corner that proved it had once been broken. Next to the frame, in a shadowed recess of the wood, rested a small object, one he hadn't seen in years, his original army patch, the very one he had mailed to a friend long ago. How it found its way back to him, he didn't know. He reached out, one hand hovering just shy of the glass, and stood still. Behind him, someone moved. The veterans had arrived, not all at once, but in pairs, in footsteps that carried history. They entered with hands in their pockets or arms folded across their chests. No salutes, no applause, just presence. One leaned against the counter. Another pulled a coin from his pocket and rolled it between his fingers, eyes locked on the photo like it told a story he already knew by heart. The tall man stepped beside Gary and said, in a low, steady voice, "We wanted it to be right. For you. For all of us." Gary turned to him. His lips parted, but the words didn't come. Instead, he offered his hand, a simple gesture that meant everything. The man took it. Maria approached then, quietly, holding a small folded cloth. She opened it with care, revealing a fresh name tag carved in brass. Gary, volunteer. She smiled as she held it out. "You helped me without even knowing," she said. "This place started because of you." He accepted the name tag but didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and removed the envelope, the one that had carried the photograph for all those years. He handed it to her. Inside it now was only a single letter, and the last words on the envelope, written in ink faded by time, were from Curtis. "If one of us doesn't make it home, the other one remembers." Maria looked down at it. Then she placed the envelope in a drawer behind the counter and closed it gently. Gary's smile came then. Not wide, not theatrical, just soft, real. A man remembering what it felt like to be seen again after so long carrying silence alone. He stood a little taller, and the store grew quieter in reverence. The light in Kyle Welder's hardware store had taken on a different hue, not because of the time of day, but because of absence. Even the sun, when filtered through dusty blinds and empty aisles, seemed muted, as if it had no one left to shine for. The fluorescents buzzed softly above, their flicker casting ghosted shadows across counters that hadn't seen real conversation in weeks. He sat behind the register, a cup of coffee in front of him, untouched and gone cold. His elbows rested on the Formica counter, hands folded, eyes unfocused. The chair beneath him creaked when he shifted, not from weight, but from time. He'd begun to notice things lately. The way the bell above the door hadn't rung since Tuesday. The way the familiar voices of weekend regulars had fallen off like autumn leaves, disappearing without protest. The way even the mailman passed a little quicker now, eyes averted. And he noticed the veterans' tokens too, still resting on the counter where they had been placed. He hadn't moved them. Not out of respect, not at first. Simply because he didn't know how. The unit patch with G, Wallace stitched in aged thread. The ribbon, the photograph of men in a muddy field. Each object now carried its own gravity, small suns of meaning too heavy to discard. Every time he reached toward them, his hand slowed, and then retreated. He had tried to tape the counterbell back together 2 days ago. The crack along its base was shallow but unmistakable, a reminder of times where, or maybe of a moment when a customer had slammed it too hard. He'd wound the tape carefully, lined the edges, smoothed the seam. It held, but the fracture showed through, and it always would. Kyle sat now in that quiet, surrounded not by judgment, but by stillness, the kind that wraps around a man when excuses no longer echo. He thought about Gary, about how he hadn't raised his voice, hadn't lashed out, had simply gathered the torn pieces of his photograph like someone collecting petals from a fallen wreath. He thought about Maria, how she had placed her name tag on the counter with the kind of finality that made no noise, but still left the air ringing. He'd spent most of his life believing respect was something that belonged to flags and anthems, to dates on a calendar and decals on a pickup truck. But now he knew better. It belonged to how you treated someone when they asked for nothing. Across the room, the community board still hung on the wall near the entrance. Its cork face was pocked with years of thumbtack holes, faded takeout menus, and yellowed roofing ads. He stood slowly, bones stiff, and walked over. In his hand was a flyer he'd picked up from the bulletin post outside the cafe. One he hadn't meant to grab, not at first. but somehow folded anyway and carried in his coat pocket like a paper thorn. He unfolded it now and smoothed the edges against the wall. The pushpin clicked in with a soft thunk. The flyer was simple. Veterans welcome here, Wallace Hardware, for those who built with more than hands. He stepped back and stared at it. The name stared back. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But something behind his eyes changed, just slightly, the faint twitch of a man not excused, but confronted by a truth he couldn't unsee. Beneath the flyer, he tacked something else. A small strip of paper, just one line, written by hand. We serve those who served. He stood there longer than he expected, his hands still at his sides. Then he returned to the counter, sat, looked down at the ribbon again. Finally, he reached out, slowly, not to take it, but to brush a speck of dust from its edge. His fingers hesitated at first, then moved. He left it there, but the gesture had happened. Outside, the wind shifted slightly, not strong enough to rattle the sign above the door, but enough to sway the faded flag pinned above the display window. It had grown dim over the years, less red, less white, but still standing. A man who had never served began to understand what service really looked like. And though no one saw it, and no one came through the door that evening, the bell still hung above it, waiting. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you're watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.